Chapter 8. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? The Bible contains the story of Jesus' life and teachings. Multiple eyewitness accounts, known as the Gospels, tell of Jesus teaching the highest level of ethics known to humanity. He took moral virtues like don't cheat on your spouse and elevated them to, if you even look at a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. That's Matthew 5:28. And he himself never sinned. He performed miracles like healing a paralyzed man and giving sight to the blind. He forgave the sins of others. Even the waves and wind obeyed him as he calmed storms with his command. He claimed to have been in existence before the world began. There have been many moral teachers and prophets throughout history, such as Moses, Buddha, Muhammad, and Confucius. These leaders claimed to hear from God, but that wasn't the case with Jesus. He didn't just claim to hear from God, he claimed to be God in the flesh. I'd reference More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell and Sean McDowell, chapter 2, for more information on that. The religious and political leaders of the time considered his claim to be blasphemy. Jesus predicted his own death and claimed that after 3 days he would rise again. Indeed, he was executed in the most shameful way possible because of who he said he was. They hung him on a cross in between two criminals, and even upon his death he prayed, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they're doing." That's Luke 23:34. He died on that cross so that our sins could be forgiven and was taken off of the cross and laid in a tomb. His followers were heartbroken, scared, and scattered. They thought he was God in the flesh, but now their leader was dead. And they too, by association, were in danger. They stayed in hiding, and they eventually moved on with their lives, right? Wrong. Something changed. Within days of his execution, Jesus' followers were boldly proclaiming that Jesus was alive. They claimed that his tomb was found empty and that an angel in the tomb delivered the good news. He is not here. He is risen. That's Matthew 28:6. They claimed that Jesus had appeared to them and that they'd eaten with him, that they'd touched him. They did this even though it caused them to be criticized, persecuted, tortured, and even killed. 11 of Jesus's 12 closest followers, called the apostles, were killed for preaching the good news of Jesus Christ after his death. Yet no one ever recanted their testimony. So we have to ask ourselves, who would die for something that they knew to be a lie? This wasn't hearsay. These were followers claiming they personally had spent time with Jesus after his death. These were men who lived the most ethical lives known. There was no financial gain to be had. Rather, the followers had every reason to deny that Jesus was alive. It makes no sense that someone would suffer persecution and death if they hadn't actually experienced the risen Jesus. As explained by former cold case homicide detective J. Warner Wallace, it's important to understand that martyrdom unto itself does not prove something is true. For instance, the Muslim terrorists who hijacked the planes on 9/11 believed they were dying a martyr's death. But they died because they believed something from thousands of years earlier. In other words, they could have mistakenly believed something that wasn't true. Jesus' followers who died were eyewitnesses. They would know firsthand whether or not what they were dying for was true. That's a completely different situation. For more information, check out Cold Case Christianity in Chapter 7 by J. Warner Wallace. Somehow there was a movement based on a man that had just been executed in the most shameful way possible. Over 10,000 people were converted in 5 weeks in a very hostile environment. That's from the Case for Christ, chapter 14. All the while, the enemies of Christianity could have stopped the movement in its tracks very simply. Jesus didn't predict that he would only spiritually rise again. He said he would bodily rise again. All they would have had to have done was to produce the dead body of Jesus, and they couldn't do it. They never even disputed that the tomb was empty. That was common knowledge. They instead tried to claim his body was stolen. So there's a lot here. Let's review the facts. Fact: Jesus was killed in the most shameful way possible because he claimed to be God in the flesh. Fact: after seeing their leader killed, Jesus' followers were hiding, scared for their lives. Fact: Jesus' body was laid in a tomb. He had predicted he would rise again in 3 days, so guards were assigned to prevent disturbance of the tomb. Fact: on the 3rd day after he was killed, Jesus' tomb was found empty. The guards were terrified. Fact: Jesus' followers came out of hiding boldly proclaiming that the risen Jesus had appeared to them, that they had eaten with him and even touched him. Fact: Jesus' followers had every reason to deny Jesus was alive. Claiming he was alive caused them to be persecuted and killed. Fact: no one ever recanted their testimony despite interrogation and torture. Fact: in the 5 weeks following Jesus' death, 10,000 were converted to Christianity in the midst of a very hostile environment. Fact: the enemies of Christianity could have squashed the entire movement if they had produced the body of Jesus to prove he had not bodily resurrected. Fact: today, over 2,000 years later, there are approximately 2.5 billion Christians alive who worship Jesus. Takeaway number 1 is that this fact pattern only makes sense if it's true. And if it's true, Jesus is God in the flesh. He willingly died for us and was risen on the 3rd day. His followers suffered persecution, torture, and death for their faith in Jesus. But they never recanted their testimony because he appeared to them after his death. They ate with him and touched him. Jesus is Lord. Some have tried to explain away the facts by claiming that the resurrection of Jesus is either an elaborate conspiracy theory or a myth. To this, we again reference J. Warner Wallace, a former cold case homicide detective. He is an expert in conspiracy theories and explains that a successful conspiracy theory requires a small number of co-conspirators and a short conspiracy time span. This makes sense. Three people are less likely to blow it than 30 people. And there's a better chance of keeping a secret for 5 minutes than for 5 years. Taken to an extreme, the ideal conspiracy would be that 2 people commit a crime together and one kills the other right after it's over. Small group, short time period. By this measure, the idea that Jesus' followers were lying about his resurrection from the dead is a horrible conspiracy theory. First off, the group is way too large. The Bible details how Jesus appeared to over 500 followers. Am I to believe that over 500 followers were in on a lie and kept it a secret for almost 60 years? That they somehow lined up their stories and no one recanted despite being scattered around the Roman Empire, interrogated, and tortured? It makes no sense. The idea that the resurrection of Jesus is a myth similarly wilts when we hold it up to inspection. Here's the main problem. Myths don't develop while thousands of eyewitnesses are alive. You can't make up a lie when there are eyewitnesses there to refute it. That's why anytime you look through history, it takes centuries for myths to develop. Takeaway number 2 is that the reports of Jesus rising from the dead were written during eyewitnesses' lifetimes. These reports make up the New Testament of the Bible. The authors essentially say, these things weren't done in a corner. There are hundreds of eyewitnesses. Here are some specific individuals. Ask them yourselves for verification. That's Acts 26:26 paraphrased. The facts point to Jesus as God in the flesh. But can we trust a book that was written over 2,000 years ago? We'll review that next.